Some empires rise with thunder, their names carried forward by conquest and noise. Others move more quietly, shaped by land, belief, and patience long before history gives them a crown. Persia belonged to the second kind. Before it ruled through kings and armies, it existed as an idea formed beneath wide skies and open fire, guided by the belief that order mattered more than fear, and that power carried responsibility as well as force. This is not only a story of expansion, it is a story of balance, of truth set against falsehood, of authority restrained by justice, and of an empire that learned how to govern without erasing those it ruled. And if this slow journey into the distant past feels worth continuing, let us move gently backward together to a time before Persia had a name, before stone remembered kings, when the land itself was still waiting. Because long before history spoke of emperors and victories, something quieter was already taking shape. Long before the word Persia was spoken, before kings carved their victories into stone, the land itself waited in silence. Wide plateaus stretched beneath an endless sky. Mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks catching the first light of dawn. Rivers moved patiently through valleys, shaping the earth as they had for thousands of years. This was a crossroads of worlds, where east met west, and where history gathered its breath. Into this vastness came the Indo-Iranian tribes. They arrived not as conquerors, but as wanderers, guided by seasons, stars, and memory. Their lives were shaped by the rhythm of movement, herds across open grasslands, fires lit against the cold, stories carried from one generation to the next. They brought with them a language, a way of seeing the world, and a deep reverence for unseen forces that governed both nature and fate. Yet these lands were not empty. Long before the tribes arrived, the people of Elam had built cities from mud brick and faith. They knew kingship, law, and ritual. Their gods watched from temples heavy with incense and thyme. To the north, the Medes ruled from rugged hills, their power woven through alliances and fear. They were warriors and rulers, respected and resisted in equal measure. Between these cultures, something quiet began to form. Above all things, there was fire. Fire was not merely warmth or light, it was purity. It was truth made visible. When flames danced beneath the open sky, they seemed to speak of order in a chaotic world. The heavens above, vast, unreachable, eternal, became symbols of balance and justice. The earth below, fertile and fragile, demanded care and responsibility. From these ideas grew a belief that the universe itself followed a moral design. That truth stood against falsehood. That light pushed back darkness, not with violence, but with constancy. And so kingship, in this land before names, was not simply power. A king was a guardian. He was expected to uphold order, to protect the weak, to stand between chaos and harmony. His authority did not come from fear alone, but from his alignment with what was right. If he ruled unjustly, the balance of the world itself could begin to fracture. Among priests and elders, around fires that burned late into the night, a quiet prophecy took shape. It was never shouted, never written boldly. It passed in murmurs and pauses. One day, it was said, a ruler would rise from these lands. Not one who conquered through terror, but one who understood restraint. A king who would bind many peoples together, not by breaking them, but by allowing them to remain themselves. An empire not built solely on the sword, but on justice. At the time, it seemed like little more than hope. Yet history, patient and watchful, was already moving. In the high halls of the Median court, where stone pillars held up painted ceilings and power lingered like incense in the air, a king found no rest. Astyages, ruler of the Medes, was haunted by dreams. Night after night, visions came to him, images heavy with meaning, impossible to ignore. In one, a vine grew from his daughter's body and spread across the land, casting its shadow over every kingdom. In another, a flood poured from her womb, drowning cities and kings alike. The court priests spoke carefully, their voices low, but their meaning was clear. A child would be born who would take his throne. Fear settled into the king's heart. Power, once secure, now felt fragile. And so Astyages made a choice that many rulers before him had made when faced with prophecy. He decided to outrun fate. When the child was born, a boy, small and silent in his mother's arms, the order was given without ceremony. The infant was to be taken away. His life was to end before it could begin. The task was handed down to a trusted servant, a man who had carried out grim commands before and learned not to question them. Yet when the moment came, something broke. The servant looked upon the child and hesitated. Perhaps it was the stillness of the newborn's breath. Perhaps it was the weight of the prophecy itself. Or perhaps it was simply the quiet voice of conscience, too long ignored. Instead of carrying out the order, he made another choice. He placed the child into the care of a shepherd and told the world that the deed was done. Far from the palace, among rolling hills and open skies, the boy lived. He grew up where the earth was hard and honest, among shepherds who measured their days by weather and movement, not ambition. There were no golden halls, no whispered intrigues, only wind, stone, and fire beneath the stars. The child was called Cyrus. From an early age there was something about him that others noticed but could not explain. He listened more than he spoke. He watched before he acted. When disputes arose among the children, he did not dominate through force, but through calm authority. Even in play, others followed him without knowing why. Destiny, it seemed, was patient. As Cyrus grew, the silence around his origins remained unbroken. Yet something ancient stirred within him, a sense of purpose without words, a pull toward leadership that did not seek cruelty or chaos. The values of the land, truth, balance, restraint, took root quietly, like seeds waiting for rain. In time, the truth of his birth could no longer be contained. Whispers reached the court. Faces turned pale. The king who had once tried to destroy fate now stood face to face with it. But even then, the moment for reckoning did not come all at once. Cyrus returned to the world of kings, but he was no longer a child of the palace alone. He carried the strength of the open land with him, and the loyalty of those who had known him before power touched his hands. The first spark of rebellion was not born in rage. It was born in certainty. A quiet understanding that the world was changing, and that no dream, no matter how feared, could be silenced forever. Power, once questioned, rarely stands unchallenged for long. The Median Empire had ruled the highlands for generations, its authority carried on tradition, fear, and the memory of past victories. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. Loyalty weakened. Old alliances grew thin. The weight of command pressed heavily on rulers who no longer inspired trust. Cyrus stood at the edge of this shifting world. He was Persian by blood, Median by upbringing, and something more by nature. Among the Persian tribes, long accustomed to serving stronger powers, his presence stirred a quiet awakening. He spoke not of destruction, but of dignity, not of revenge, but of belonging. His words carried the calm certainty of someone who believed order could be restored, not imposed. When rebellion came, It did not arrive as chaos. It moved like a tide. Persian leaders, once scattered and cautious, found common cause. Old rivalries were set aside not because they were forgotten, but because something larger had appeared before them, a future shaped by their own hands. Under Cyrus, they united beneath a single banner, one that promised purpose rather than plunder. The Medes responded as empires often do, slowly and with disbelief. Their king, still burdened by prophecy, trusted the strength of tradition over the warning signs of change. Armies were sent, commands were issued, but the old certainty was gone. Soldiers hesitated, allies wavered. When the final struggle came, it was swift and strangely restrained. Cities opened their gates. Commanders changed sides. The great structure of Median power, long feared and respected, folded inward upon itself. It was not annihilated, it was absorbed. Old power collapsed not in flames but in surrender. From its remains something new emerged. Cyrus did not take the title of king in triumphal fury. There were no wild celebrations, no rivers of blood. Instead there was acknowledgement, recognition that authority had passed not by accident, but by design. He was crowned as king of Persia, not merely as a conqueror, but as a unifier. For the first time, the Persians stood as more than subjects. They stood as a people. An empire, young and untested, took its first breath. It was built not on the erasure of the past, but on its transformation. The Medes were not destroyed. They were woven into a broader vision, one that promised stability through fairness, strength through restraint. History had changed hands, and the world, though it did not yet know it, would never be the same again. With Persia newly born, the world beyond its borders began to take notice. To the west lay Lydia, a kingdom rich in gold and confidence, ruled by a king who trusted in fortune and ancient alliances. Its cities gleamed, its markets thrived, and its power seemed secure. Yet when Cyrus turned his gaze in that direction, he did not rush. He moved with patience, measuring the land and the will of those who ruled it. When Lydia fell, it did so without needless ruin. The clash was brief, the outcome decisive. The Lydian king was spared, not paraded in chains, but allowed to live with dignity. The wealth of the kingdom was claimed, yet its people were not broken. It was the first clear sign that Persia's expansion would follow a different path, but it was Babylon that would define Cyrus forever. Babylon stood as a symbol of ancient might, a city of towering walls, deep canals, and gods older than memory. Many had feared it. Few had entered it without bloodshed. When Persian forces approached, the world expected devastation. Instead, the gates opened. The city was taken without fire or massacre. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. He walked beneath its towering structures with deliberate calm, respecting the customs and beliefs of those who lived there. Where others would have torn temples down, he ordered them repaired. Where captives had lived in exile, he allowed them to return home. Prisoners were freed, sacred places were reopened. The old rhythms of worship were permitted to continue, untouched by foreign command. For the first time, tolerance became policy. Cyrus understood something rare among conquerors. That fear ruled only as long as strength was visible. Trust, once earned, endured. By allowing each people to honor their own gods, speak their own tongues, and keep their traditions, he transformed enemies into subjects, and subjects into allies. This vision was carved into clay, not as a boast, but as a promise. The Cyrus cylinder spoke of restoration rather than domination, of order replacing chaos, of justice returning to the land. It did not declare him a god. It declared him a steward An empire took shape that was vast yet strangely gentle. Roads connected distant lands. Messengers carried law instead of threats. The authority of Persia reached far, but its grip was light. People obeyed not only because they must, but because life under Persian rule allowed them to remain whole. In this choice, mercy over terror, Persia became something new. Not merely an empire of conquest, but an empire of trust. Even the greatest rulers cannot outrun time. After years of expansion and order, Cyrus turned his attention eastward, toward lands less settled and less predictable. These regions lay far from the great cities and royal roads, where borders faded into open steppe and ancient rivalries endured. It was here, at the edge of the known empire, that Cyrus chose to lead once more. He was no longer young, yet he rode as he always had, not as a distant king, but as a presence among his soldiers. The campaign was not one of glory, but of necessity. To secure the frontier, to prevent chaos from spilling inward. The rhythm of war was slower now, heavier, shaped by caution rather than ambition. The final battle came far from the heart of Persia. There were no marble walls, no cheering crowds, only dust rising beneath the sun, the sound of movement, and the quiet understanding that every life, even one shaped by prophecy, must eventually meet its end. In the confusion of battle, Cyrus fell. News travelled slowly at first, as though the world itself hesitated to accept it. When the truth reached the cities of the empire, disbelief followed, then silence, then mourning. From the highlands to the river valleys, people paused. Fires burned low, voices softened. He had been more than a king. He had been a promise. Cyrus was carried home and laid to rest with simplicity according to his wishes. No towering monument marked his grave. No display of wealth surrounded him. Only stone, earth, and memory. A man had died. But what he had stood for did not. Across the empire, his ideals endured, in laws that favoured balance, in governors who ruled with restraint, in peoples who remembered that power did not always arrive with cruelty. Cyrus had shown that an empire could be strong without being savage, vast without being hollow. In death, he became something greater than a conqueror. He became a measure, and history for a moment stood still. When Cyrus was gone, the empire did not fall with him. It passed, whole and immense, into the hands of his son. Cambyses II inherited a realm that stretched across mountains, deserts, and seas. It was unified, wealthy, and respected. Yet it was also delicate, held together by the balance his father had carefully maintained. To rule such an empire required patience, humility, and restraint. Cambyses possessed none of these in full. From the beginning, his reign felt different. Where Cyrus had listened, Cambyses commanded. Where mercy had once softened authority, pride now hardened it. The empire still obeyed, but the tone had changed. Fear began to replace trust. His greatest ambition lay to the southwest. Egypt, ancient and self-assured, had long resisted foreign rule. Its temples rose beside the Nile, its traditions rooted in eternity. Cambyses marched in with overwhelming force, and Egypt fell. The conquest was swift, but the aftermath was troubled. Sacred customs were mocked. Priests were humiliated. Acts meant to assert dominance instead deepened resentment. Whispers followed him everywhere. Stories spread of cruelty and unpredictability, of punishments carried out without reason, of sacred animals killed to prove power over gods themselves. Whether all were true mattered less than the fact that people believed them. Then came darker rumors. It was said that Cambyses had ordered the death of his own brother, fearing a rival to his throne. Whether driven by paranoia or calculation, the act stained his reign. Blood spilled within the royal house weakened the very foundation of authority. As months passed, instability grew. Rebellions flared at the edges of the empire. Officials hesitated. Loyalty became uncertain. Cambyses himself seemed increasingly isolated, trapped by suspicion and rage. Some said he was mad. Others believed the empire was simply breaking under a ruler who did not understand its fragile design. Perhaps both were true. Power, once balanced by justice, had tipped too far toward force. The legacy of Cyrus still lingered, but it was fading, strained by excess and fear, and history, ever watchful, prepared the next turning. Cambyses did not return from Egypt in triumph. His rule ended far from the heart of the empire, sudden and uncertain, leaving behind questions with no clear answers. In the silence that followed his death, authority unraveled. The careful structure built by Cyrus began to sway, as though the ground beneath it had shifted. Into this uncertainty stepped a figure who claimed the throne. He called himself king, presenting familiar names and royal blood, but doubt followed him like a shadow. Many believed he was an impostor, a man wearing the memory of a prince to seize power. Whether true or not, the damage was done. Trust vanished. The empire fractured. Rebellion spread like fire across dry land. Regions rose in defiance. Governors declared independence. Old loyalties dissolved as each province tested how far the center had weakened. Persia, once united, stood on the edge of collapse, pulled apart by fear and ambition. It was in this moment of disorder that Darius emerged. He was not the most obvious choice, not the most celebrated, but he possessed something the empire desperately needed. A belief that chaos could be confronted, not endured. With a small group of allies, bound by shared resolve, Darius moved swiftly. The false king was overthrown, his claim ended in blood. Yet seizing the throne was only the beginning. Darius faced an empire in open revolt. He did not hesitate. Campaign after campaign followed, each one firm, deliberate, and uncompromising. Rebellions were crushed. Authority was reasserted. The message was clear. Disorder would not be tolerated. But Darius understood that force alone could not heal what had been broken. As peace slowly returned, he looked beyond survival toward structure. He envisioned an empire strengthened not just by armies, but by systems, by law, by clarity. Where Cyrus had ruled through trust, Darius would rule through order. Carefully defined, carefully maintained. From chaos he forged stability. The empire, bruised and weary, began to steady itself once more. And as the dust settled, Persia stood not merely restored, but reshaped, ready for its greatest height yet to come. With rebellion silenced and the throne secured, Darius turned from war to design. He understood that an empire held together by force alone would always tremble. What Persia needed was structure, clear, fair, and enduring. And so, quietly and methodically, Darius reshaped the world he ruled. The empire was divided into regions, each governed by a satrap. These men were not kings, nor were they free to rule as they pleased. Their power was balanced, watched by royal officials, checked by law. No single hand could gather too much control. Authority flowed downward, but responsibility flowed upward. For the first time, the empire truly knew itself. Land was measured, people were counted. Taxes were assessed not as punishment but as an obligation. Each region contributed according to its capacity, binding distant lands into a shared system. What had once been tribute taken by threat became a predictable rhythm that sustained the state. Across this vast domain, a road was laid. The royal road cut through mountains and plains, connecting the heart of Persia to its farthest reaches. Along it, messengers travelled without rest, carrying commands, news, and law. Distance shrank. Time itself seemed to bend beneath the will of order. At the centre of it all, Persepolis began to rise, not a city of defence, but of ceremony. Stone columns reached skyward, carved with images of many peoples, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, each shown in dignity, bringing gifts rather than chains. It was a vision stone of what the empire claimed to be, diverse, united, and ordered. Beneath this structure lay belief. Darius embraced the ancient ideals of truth and falsehood, light and deception. To rule justly was to stand on the side of truth. To lie was not merely immoral, but dangerous, a force that weakened the world itself. The king was not a god. He was a guardian, chosen to protect order against chaos. In inscriptions, Darius spoke not of conquest alone, but of justice, of balance, of responsibility. His authority rested on the idea that power must serve something greater than itself. Under his reign, Persia reached its height, not simply in land or wealth, but in confidence. The empire moved with steady purpose, governed by law, connected by roads, guided by an ideal that believed order could be maintained against the endless pull of disorder. For a time, the world seemed held in balance. At the far western edge of the empire, where the land met the restless sea, the balance began to strain. The Ionian cities lay along the coast, Greek in speech and spirit, Persian in rule. For years they had lived beneath the empire's order, prosperous, connected, and largely undisturbed. Yet their loyalty was thin, stretched between freedom and stability, between local pride and distant authority. When rebellion came, it spread quickly. The Ionian revolt was not born from hunger or cruelty, but from identity. The cities rose against Persian governors, driven by the belief that self-rule was worth the risk of destruction. Flames touched great harbours. Persian officials were driven out. The western frontier shook. Darius answered with resolve. To him, rebellion was not merely defiance. It was a lie threatening the order of the world. Persian forces moved steadily, reclaiming the coast, restoring control city by city. The revolt was crushed, but its echo carried farther than expected. Across the sea, the Greek mainland had taken notice. Small, divided, and fiercely independent, the Greek cities saw Persia not as an administrator, but as a shadow over their freedom. Aid had been given to the rebels, insult had been delivered. And now the empire turned its gaze westward. What followed was not simply war. It was a meeting of opposites. Persia moved as an empire, vast, disciplined, confident in its systems. The Greeks fought as citizens, bound to their land and laws, valuing independence above unity. When the two worlds met at Marathon, the scale felt unequal. Persia had faced greater foes before. Yet the battle ended in shock. Against expectation, the Persian force withdrew. The loss was not devastating in numbers, but it was profound in meaning. For the first time, the empire had been openly resisted and pushed back by a people it had not absorbed. News travelled east along the royal road, carrying more than defeat. It carried doubt. The fire that had once expanded outward with certainty now flickered, meeting resistance it did not fully understand. Persia remained vast and powerful, but something had changed. The idea of invincibility had been broken, and beneath the surface both worlds prepared for what was to come. When Darius died, the question of the West remained unanswered. The empire passed to his son Xerxes, a ruler born into vastness and expectation. He inherited not only lands and law, but a wound to imperial pride. The defeat at Marathon lingered like an unresolved thought, a challenge that demanded response. Xerxes chose to answer it with magnitude. Preparations unfolded on a scale the world had never witnessed. Soldiers gathered from every corner of the empire, men of many tongues and customs, bound beneath one command. Supplies were gathered, roads reinforced, and the weight of Persia leaned westward. This would not be a measured correction. It would be a declaration. To reach Greece, the army crossed the Hellespont. Bridges were thrown across the narrow sea, binding continents together. When storms destroyed them, Xerxes ordered the waters punished, an act remembered not for its power, but for its symbolism. Nature itself was being challenged, bent beneath imperial will. At Thermopylae, the advance was briefly halted. A narrow pass held by a small Greek force slowed the immense Persian army. Days passed, losses mounted, yet even here the empire's strength prevailed. The path opened and the way forward was cleared. The resistance was crushed, but its defiance left a mark deeper than the delay. Athens lay open. The city was taken, its buildings set aflame, its sacred spaces reduced to ash. The act was meant to end the struggle, to break the spirit of resistance through spectacle and fear. Smoke rose into the sky as a symbol of vengeance fulfilled. But war does not end simply because one side believes it should. At sea, near the narrow waters of Salamis, strategy overtook size. Persian ships, crowded and unwieldy, met a Greek fleet that knew the tides and channels. Confusion followed. Commands failed. Momentum collapsed. The loss was devastating. From his throne on the shore, Xerxes watched the imperial fleet break apart. The greatest force ever assembled had been undone not by weakness, but by overconfidence. Pride had drowned out caution. Scale had replaced understanding. The empire survived the defeat. But something essential has been shaken. The belief that size alone could command the world had been proven false, and the fire that once moved outward without question now burned more carefully, its light no longer unquestioned by gods or men. The war did not end at Salamis. Though shaken, Persia still stood. Its armies remained vast, its reach immense. Xerxes withdrew eastward, leaving his generals to finish what had begun. The empire had not been defeated, only tested. The final confrontation came at Plataea. There on open ground, Persian and Greek forces met once more. The battle was hard and uncertain, marked by confusion and exhaustion on both sides. When it ended, the Persian army withdrew. The Western campaign was over. Persia survived. But survival came at a price that could not be easily measured. The confidence that had once unified the empire was fractured. The Western wars had drained strength and focus, pulling attention away from the delicate balance within. Soldiers returned home tired, treasuries thinned. The sense of inevitable order began to fade. Within the royal court, shadows grew longer. Power struggles replaced shared purpose. Advisors competed for influence. Assassinations whispered through palace corridors, quiet and efficient. Kings became cautious, then suspicious. Trust, the foundation laid by Cyrus, continued to erode. The empire remained enormous. From the Indus to the Aegean, Persia still ruled. Roads still carried messengers. Laws were still enforced, yet beneath the appearance of strength, weariness settled in. Authority felt heavier, slower to respond, less certain of itself. Victory had been claimed, but peace never followed, and in the silence after war, decline began not with collapse but with fatigue. Empires rarely fall at their borders. More often they weaken at the centre, quietly, over time. Within the Persian court, intrigue became a way of life. Kings rose and fell not through conquest but through whispers, poisoned cups, and sudden deaths in the night. Power no longer passed with clarity. It was seized, guarded, and feared. Fear shaped decisions. Rulers trusted fewer voices, listening instead to those who flattered or promised safety. Honest counsel faded from the halls of power. Corruption took its place, spreading through offices once defined by duty. Authority became something to exploit, not uphold. Beyond the palace, the provinces felt the change. Satraps, once careful stewards, grew restless. Some ruled as kings in all but name, withholding tribute, raising private armies, testing how far the centre's reach had weakened. Others crushed their people with harsh demands, accelerating resentment instead of loyalty. Wealth poured into Persia as it always had. Gold-filled treasuries, luxury surrounded the court. But discipline, once the empire's quiet strength, began to disappear. Soldiers trained less. Officials expected reward before service. The old belief in order gave way to comfort. Loyalty thinned. Not through open rebellion at first, but through indifference. Provinces obeyed when watched and hesitated when not. The empire still functioned, but its heart no longer beat with shared purpose. The structure built by Darius remained standing, yet inside it, the supports were rotting. And history, patient as ever, waited for the moment when pressure would reveal what time had already undone. When Darius III came to the throne, he did not arrive as a conqueror or a reformer. He arrived as a necessity. The empire he inherited was vast beyond reason, stretching across lands that no longer shared a single purpose. Its size, once a source of strength, had become a burden. Every decision echoed across too many borders. Every delay carried consequence. Darius did not seek this weight, yet it settled upon him all the same. He was a reluctant ruler in an age that demanded certainty. Within the court, old rivalries persisted. Generals questioned orders. Satraps guarded their own interests. The king stood at the center of a structure that still looked powerful, but no longer moved as one. Authority remained, but momentum was gone. Opportunities came and passed. Warnings were slow to reach him, and when they did, they were softened by fear. Decisions hesitated between caution and action, pleasing neither. Where earlier kings had imposed clarity, Darius allowed uncertainty to linger. Each moment of delay made the empire heavier, harder to steer. Beyond the western horizon, something was rising. At first, it seemed distant, almost insignificant. A young power, restless and ambitious, gathering strength beyond Persia's old enemies. Reports arrived, then more reports. Victories too swift to ignore, a force driven not by administration, but by momentum. The shadow of the storm crept closer. Darius prepared as best he could, yet preparation without unity faltered. The empire still possessed wealth, manpower, and history, but history alone could not command the future. The balance that once defined Persia had already been lost. The end did not announce itself with collapse. It approached quietly, carried on the wind from the west. When Darius III came to the throne, he did not arrive as a conqueror or a reformer. He arrived as a necessity. The empire he inherited was vast beyond reason, stretching across lands that no longer shared a single purpose. Its size, once a source of strength, had become a burden. Every decision echoed across too many borders. Every delay carried consequence. Darius did not seek this weight, yet it settled upon him all the same. He was a reluctant ruler in an age that demanded certainty. Within the court, old rivalries persisted. Generals questioned orders. Satraps guarded their own interests. The king stood at the center of a structure that still looked powerful, but no longer moved as one. Authority remained, but momentum was gone. Opportunities came and passed. Warnings were slow to reach him, and when they did, they were softened by fear. Decisions hesitated between caution and action, pleasing neither. Where earlier kings had imposed clarity, Darius allowed uncertainty to linger. Each moment of delay made the empire heavier, harder to steer. Beyond the western horizon, something was rising. At first, it seemed distant, almost insignificant. A young power, restless and ambitious, gathering strength beyond Persia's old enemies. Reports arrived, then more reports. Victories too swift to ignore, a force driven not by administration, but by momentum. The shadow of the storm crept closer. Darius prepared as best he could, yet preparation without unity faltered. The empire still possessed wealth, manpower, and history, but history alone could not command the future. The balance that once defined Persia had already been lost. The end did not announce itself with collapse. It approached quietly, carried on the wind from the west. After Gaugamela, the empire no longer moved as one. Darius III fled eastward, not in hope of victory but in search of refuge. The roads that once carried law and order now carried fear and uncertainty. Provinces opened their gates to the advancing storm, choosing survival over loyalty to a crown that could no longer protect them. Among his own men, trust vanished. Satraps and commanders, once bound by duty, now weighed their chances. Some believed the empire could still be saved. Others believed it already gone. In this fracture, betrayal took root. Darius was seized, not by enemies, but by those who feared being on the losing side of history. His death came quietly. There was no final battle, no last speech. The last king of the Achaemenid line died abandoned, far from the palaces of his ancestors. With him ended a dynasty that had ruled much of the known world for centuries. Alexander entered the heart of Persia as a victor. Cities fell, treasuries opened, palaces stood empty. Persepolis, once a symbol of unity and order, was consumed by fire. Whether by design or impulse, its flames marked the end of an age. The empire of kings was gone. Yet Persia was not erased. Its roads endured, its laws shaped future rulers, its ideas of justice, tolerance, and order outlived the men who first carried them. Administrations learned from its systems. Conquerors adopted its customs. Even Alexander himself ruled not as a destroyer, but as an inheritor. Empires rise, empires fall, but culture lingers, like embers beneath ash. And long after the banners were lowered and the crowns broken, the spirit of Persia remained, quiet, enduring, and impossible to extinguish. The empire was gone, but its shadow stretched far beyond its fall. Those who came after could not rule without borrowing from what Persia had built. Administrations learned to divide power rather than concentrate it. Roads became tools of unity. Law replaced impulse. Even Rome, rising in the west, absorbed Persian methods, governorships shaped like satrapies, taxation measured and recorded, authority balanced by structure rather than fear. Persia had taught the world how an empire could function. Its ideas travelled farther than its armies ever had. Later rulers studied its systems, adopted its tolerance, and echoed its belief that order required more than strength. The notion that a king was accountable to justice, not merely elevated above it, endured long after crowns changed hands, and the land itself did not forget. Iran remained a living civilization, reshaping itself through centuries of conquest and change. Languages evolved, faiths transformed, dynasties rose and vanished. Yet beneath it all, the ancient pulse continued, the reverence for truth, the memory of fire and sky, the understanding that identity could survive even when power did not. Persia was conquered, yes, but it was never erased. What it gave to history could not be burned, dismantled, or carried away. Its legacy proved stronger than conquest, more patient than time. It lived on in governance, in culture, in the quiet assumptions of how civilization should be ordered. Empires fall by the sword. Persia fell into eternity.